Hello and welcome, everyone. This is Pamela Lavitt from the Stroum Jewish Community Center, Arts and Ideas. We're just going to wait a few moments for participants to filter in. You can enjoy the slideshow and read a little bit more about our honorable guest, David Sipress, and learn more about his book. We'll see you in just a moment. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the Stroum Jewish Community Center Arts and Ideas event. David will be joining us in just a moment. The big reveal just happened by accident. We are so excited that he's joining us from New York. We are thrilled to have another illustrious author join us as part of the Arts and Ideas Chew on This series, which brings us authors, thought leaders, and chefs throughout the years to feed the mind, body, and soul. We have felt that since COVID, while we've had a reduction in our online programming, we are really thrilled that we can continue to bring illustrious authors and in this case, cartoonists and writers like David Sipress to Seattle. And we're really excited that you're joining us. It is a sunny Sunday. So without further ado, just a couple of notes about the business of today's program. And then we are absolutely thrilled to join and have a conversation. And David has prepared a wonderful presentation for us, because how could we not enjoy the many years of illustrations that he's put together for us. First of all, I am so excited that we are winding down our series this year. Last night, we had an incredible event live with Melissa Rivers, who was very funny. And today we continue with the What's So Funny with the book by David Sipress, which is a memoir of a cartoonist. But first of all, I want to say there are a couple of other upcoming programs. One in particular, Israel turned 75 this year. And while we felt that we didn't want to just do a celebration of that, we wanted to bring the community together for additional deep thinking about the tensions and visions of Israel. So please join us. If you saw the slide, on May 21st, we are also bringing in another author from New York, a professor of CUNY, Eric Alterman, who wrote for many years for The Nation, The Guardian, and many other publications, Rolling Stone, but he has written a book called We Are Not One. He is our keynote conversation. And then we have in the morning a series of workshops. So whether you have strong opinions about Israel or feel like you need more information to enter the dialogue, there is both a virtual workshop as well as an in-person workshop. And we hope that everyone in our community will learn a lot by attending this event. It is on May 21st. Please check out the information at sjcc.org/arts and join us at our first Seattle Z3. We have lots of things coming up in the fall as we will be launching a new season. We will be focusing on Israeli chefs and food. We will have 2 chefs coming from Israel in October and November. So please check back regularly and you'll get information in your inbox. So let's start today's program. It will run about an hour long. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A. I know that many of us have been reading The New Yorker for many years. And if you haven't, I still think that you'll find that there's a lot to ask about the process that David is going to kind of let us in on, what is behind the cartoons that he has published for so many years. First of all, David Sipress has been a staff cartoonist at The New Yorker since 1998, and he has published nearly 700 cartoons. He teaches widely on cartooning, and his autobiographical writing appears frequently at newyorker.com. Please, everyone, welcome David Sipress to Seattle from afar. David, join us. And please, before you begin your presentation, we really appreciate your being here. Everyone, please, anytime, throw it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time afterwards for Q&A. So without further ado, welcome to Seattle. We're glad to have you here. And I'm going to turn over the reins to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Pam, is everything, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, hear you just great.
Okay. So my book, What's So Funny? It's about 4 people mainly, the members of my family. And this is a photograph of them. My father, Nat, on the left, came to this country just in the eve of World War I, and lived an impoverished childhood as an immigrant, but eventually became a very successful merchant. He had a jewelry store called Revere Jewelers on Lexington Avenue for many years, and he became a terrifically successful guy. My mother, Estelle, on the right, she's wearing her sweet, what I thought of as her outside face. because I could never convince anybody who ever saw her that she could be anything but sweet on the inside part of her life. In the middle is my sister Linda, who had a very troubled life. And down below there is me, causing trouble already, pointing my gun at the camera. And I thought I would begin my presentation by doing a reading from the introduction of my book. I was born and raised in New York City. You could say that there's nothing particularly special about that, but deep down, I've always felt that there is. Perhaps it's the simple fact that almost all the New Yorkers I know have come to the city from somewhere else. I am from here. Being a New Yorker from the get-go has permanently shaped my worldview. The sun rises on the Upper East Side and sets on the Upper West Side. This cartoon was published in the New Yorker in 2001, making it one of the first I sold to the magazine after 25 years of submitting and being rejected. The idea came to me in the summer of 2000 when I was walking south on Fifth Avenue after an afternoon visit to the Met. Somewhere around 72nd Street, the memory of another long ago walk on Fifth popped into my head, and out popped this cartoon. It works that way sometimes, the out-of-the-blue arrival of the fully formed idea. The memory in question involved my parents, my older sister, and me. I was 8 years old. The four of us had gone out to dinner one early summer evening at my parents' favorite restaurant, Gino's, on Lexington Avenue, across the street from my father's jewelry shop. There were always well-known people dining at Gino's. A few weeks before, we were there with a friend of my parents, and he pointed out Charles Adams sitting at the bar. I remember thinking that he looked just like one of his drawings, something people would say about me one day. That night, we also saw the actor Montgomery Clift, who was a customer of my father's, sitting at a small table with Arthur Miller, whose literary accomplishments paled, as far as I was concerned, beside the fact that he was married to Marilyn Monroe. As we were on our way out of the restaurant, my father stepped back and reverently held the door for the arriving Bess Meyerson, famous television personality and the first Jewish Miss America. My family's relaxed, primarily secular Jewishness was a complicated and sometimes confusing affair. As a kid, I understood that Jewish was just one thing we were, more fundamental perhaps, but not all that different from our being New Yorkers or Democrats or Brooklyn Dodger fans. On the other hand, we were always quick to root and celebrate members of our tribe who broke barriers and made it big: athletes, scientists, writers, artists, actors, diplomats, and smart, talented beauty queens like Bess Meyerson. It wasn't dark yet when we walked out onto Lexington Avenue. There was a fancy black limousine parked in front of the restaurant. A uniformed chauffeur was leaning against the fender, holding a leash, at the end of which a little French poodle leapt back and forth, barking like a maniac at the door of Gino's. "He's funny," I said to my mother. "I wonder who he belongs to." "Whoever it is, they better own a pair of earplugs," my father said. The poodle came over to me, looked up, and barked at me like I was the problem. "Don't get too close," my mother warned. "It's the little ones that really bite." "Let's go," my sister pleaded. She was always impatient, especially when the four of us were out together. My mother suggested we take a walk on Fifth Avenue before getting a taxi back to our apartment on the Upper West Side. "All right, but I just hope we can find a cab," said my father, sounding grumpy for no apparent reason, as was so often the case. "They aren't so frequent on Fifth," he explained. "Fifth goes downtown," my sister chimed in. "They won't want to take us." "All we can do is ask," said my mother. "Maybe we can ask Fifth to go uptown," I said. My mother laughed. We walked in spite of my father's misgivings, still hearing the poodle halfway to Park Avenue. When we turned onto Fifth, as taxi after vacant taxi sped by without my father lifting a hand to signal, I looked up and was startled by the sight of the dreamy, sparkly skyline of Central Park South in Midtown Manhattan, silhouetted against the dusky pink sky, and I felt a powerful surge of desire. When I grew up, I told myself, I was going to escape the New York of my parents and find a way into the New York I saw glittering above the treetops of Central Park. It would be a New York filled with cool, amazing, talented people like the actors and famous writers and artists I saw dining at Gino's, people who didn't need to worry about every little thing. I would be an artist too, I decided. What kind of artist would I be? I knew that I loved to draw. I also knew that I was funny. At least my mother thought so. I did the calculation. Drawing plus funny equals cartoonist. So in large part, my book is about my family. And just to give you a sense of where it goes, here's a couple of cartoons. We've been thinking about what we want to do with your life, which was very much my experience as a young man. And then there's this one. Here's the deal. We call the shots when you're young. You call the shots when we're old. And everything in between is a nonstop battle for control. So as you can tell from the introduction, I've hinted at a couple of themes of the book. One of them is my parents' Jewishness and the confusion it caused me. Like many Reform Jewish families in the Upper West Side in that era, in the middle of the 20th century, they did very confusing things like celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas, something I captured in this cartoon. Much of the book is about my father, and a lot of it is about my frustration and my difficulty in understanding why he was so secretive about his past, about his immigrant past. I've since learned that that's not unusual for immigrants of my father's generation, but he never answered any questions. He never would talk about it. And in this cartoon, I kind of summarized about the limits of the information that I got from him. The country Papa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty where everyone was always happy. By the way, that's one of my favorite captions that I've ever written. I love it because it has a wonderful rhythm to it, and also because it has what we think of as cartoonists as the kicker at the end. The joke comes with the very last word. I also really like stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty. Very proud of that phrase. So when I first started writing the book, I had some worries about whether or not I could actually do it. For one thing, I'd spent my life writing lines of dialogue, one sentence or two sentences long at the most. How was I going to write a whole book? And also, there was this other problem. Nothing interesting has ever happened to me, a memoir. That's kind of how I felt at the beginning. But the more I got into it and the more I started writing, the book began to emerge, and the stories of my childhood and then what happened afterwards started rolling around in my head and landing on the page. I wrote the first draft of the book for about a year, and then I had this particular moment with my wife. My wife Ginny is my editor, first reader, and main source of any kind of help that I need around something that I'm working on. And she jokes that she had to have 2 therapy sessions before she had the conversation with me, where she said to me when I showed her and she had read it, David, it's not good. Why is it not good? It's not funny. You are a funny person. Funny is what you do. You have to find a way, even to talk about the really tragic and difficult stuff, and never lose that humor, which is so crucial to your voice. And so I went back and spent another year writing another draft. And one of the things I did to solve the problem was I turned to my cartoons and used more and more of them in the book as they helped elucidate and magnify various themes that I had and anecdotes that came up. And what I discovered in that process is there's almost nothing in my life that I haven't made a cartoon about at some point. For example, one of the really difficult moments in the book was when I told my father that I was dropping out of graduate school at Harvard. For my father, standing behind the counter in his store when a customer came in, I think what usually happened was he'd say, oh, the emerald necklace, this and that. And he'd say, oh, by the way, did I mention I have a son at Harvard? He was so proud of it. And it was really, really difficult for me to break the news to him. And it caused a terrible rift. But of course, I discovered that I had made a cartoon pretty much about it at some point. You're quitting school after everything we sacrificed for you? When I say I learned that I made cartoons about everything, even difficult things, I even made a cartoon about that difficult conversation I had with my wife about the book. Here it is, my book. I'll be interested to hear your compliments. So let me unshare my screen for a second here if I can. Well, I'm not sure how to do that right now, so that's not important.
At the top, David, there's a stop share at the very top.
At the very top, stop share. It's really not important. I won't do that right now. Oh, I see it. Yes. I just feel like you might want to see my face for a couple of seconds. So I thought I would talk a little about another important aspect of my book, which is that it's about the art of cartooning, about my process and my career, and give you a little insight. And one of the ways I like to talk about it is I talk about it in three parts. It's the unique art form that involves drawing and writing together, and also the crucial coming up with ideas. And so I thought I'd begin a little, just talk a little about my drawing. One second. I just wish I could loosen up like you. My drawing, I like to think of as being direct and spontaneous. I like the reader to experience my drawing as if I just made up the idea and I drew it. No, I admire people whose work is carefully hewn and beautifully rendered, but I like the direct approach because the spontaneity is really crucial to getting my ideas across. The drawing is one part, another part is writing, and then what we're mainly talking about is writing captions. Captions are these very thin filaments that can be disrupted by a bad punctuation mark or the wrong word or things not in the right order or a rhythm that doesn't actually work. And so writing them, it looks like it's pretty simple, but actually a lot of work goes into it, even a simple line like this. Here's an example of something. I handed this cartoon in several years ago, use your core, and it got rejected. And I went back and I looked at it and I thought something's wrong with that caption. I don't know what it is, but something isn't right. And then I finally figured it out and changed it. Use thy core. That made it funnier and made it work better. And that's the kind of process and thinking that goes into these very wonderfully short and precise lines of dialogue. Every cartoon is like a little piece of theater, and you really want the reader to follow along from the beginning to the end without being disrupted by any of the bad things that I mentioned a moment ago. So I have to say that sometimes the very best writing in cartoons is when there's no caption at all. That's what we cartoonists kind of consider the most refined example of the form. Here's one of mine with no caption. I'm a longtime student of yoga, and this cartoon reflects a little of that, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then there's the big topic, coming up with ideas. There are many ways that ideas come to me, and I'll try to just summarize just a few of them. One main way I get them is from drawing. I make a drawing and I look at it, I contemplate it, I try to think of what I could do with it and turn it into a cartoon. Here's a drawing I recently made. I looked at this drawing over and over, not just for 1 week, but for several weeks. And I kept thinking, I tried out different jokes. I tried something about brunch being the 11th commandment. I tried to do something about, not coveting thy neighbor's wife. I did all kinds of things that didn't really hit the mark. And then I realized the joke was right there all the time, hiding in plain sight, right in the drawing itself. There was no need for me to cross the border and go outside of it. One question, with such a big hand, how did you write so small? As I said, I was a longtime yoga student, and one thing I have discovered in my life is that I have something I think of as my cartoon brain. And my cartoon brain is on all the time. In every situation I'm in, some little part of my mind is thinking, what's funny about this? How can I turn this into a cartoon? And that can sometimes happen in really inappropriate situations, like in yoga class. For example, lying in Shavasana several years ago, just trying to be calm and relax and turn off my mind, I couldn't help it. This idea just popped into my head. Why so downward facing, dog? When I say that my cartoon brain can be inappropriate, the best example I can think of involves, again, my wife, and an argument we were having several years ago. It was a pretty fierce one. And we were going back and forth. And then all of a sudden, she stopped and looked at me and said, David, you're not thinking up a cartoon right now, are you? Oh, no, I said, no, not possible. I would never do that. Of course not. And then about 4 weeks later, she saw this cartoon in the New Yorker. Well, if it really doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? So that's my cartoon brain functioning in spite of myself. And who knows, I may come up with something just from this presentation tonight. I have to, as a cartoonist, keep my ear to the culture all the time and think about trends and themes that happen in the world around me. One of my favorite examples of turning my cartoon brain to that activity is this one. The subject of tonight's discussion is, why are there no women on this panel? But the main source of cartoon ideas for me is worry and anxiety. And I'm not alone in this. Many cartoonists, such as Roz Chast and others you're familiar with, say the same thing. That's where they go when they need ideas, to the things that scare them, the things that worry them, and the things that make them anxious. And that's certainly true of me. When I go to my studio in the morning and I sit down at my desk, I don't think to myself, I'm going to come up with a funny cartoon today, a good joke. I think about my life, I think about my experience, and more often than not, that involves worries that I turn into humor. It's not exactly a kind of therapy, but it is a wonderful tool to have to help one get through some of the difficult things in life. It certainly helped me get through some of the stuff I write about in my book. I have to say that for me, there is absolutely no shortage of worries, something I captured in this cartoon. This is everything you've ever worried about. That's everything you've ever worried about that actually happened. The worries can involve all kinds of things I'm sure we're all familiar with. One of the big ones is, of course, an upcoming doctor's appointment. Don't forget to call it a procedure, makes it less scary. I really love the little guy, that's me, looking pathetic, going into the doctor's office. Another thing I worry about, like all of us, is the state of our nation and politics. I do political cartoons. I have done them for the New Yorker website for many years. At one point, at several points, I was what's called the daily cartoonist. And every day I would get up, and by 8 o'clock in the morning, having read the paper and digested the news, I would send in a cartoon to be published later that morning on the website. Needless to say, it got pretty exhausting. And during some of the difficult years we've experienced, it became a little bit soul-killing at times. This is my most popular cartoon coming up. It is my most copied, most shared, most stolen. And every time the world kind of goes to hell a little bit, it shows up all over the internet. My desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. And what's interesting to me about this is that there's no joke here. It's not a ha-ha joke. But what it is it gives me a real definition of what humor in cartoons is for me. It's a connection. I put into a cartoon something that I'm feeling about what's going on. I'm not attacking anybody. I'm not making any political points. I'm talking about how we're experiencing what's going on. And what's amazing and miraculous to me is that my readers, wind up sharing the same experience and have the same thoughts. And it's that connection that we make that makes the humor. That's where the joke is. A great cartoon is a combination of something really familiar, where the reader makes that connection, and also something surprising. And I think in this one, it's the caption that surprises. As I said, my political cartoons tend, for the most part, to be this kind of cartoon, where I talk about what we're all feeling and experiencing rather than what's going on itself. The way I do that sometimes is that I use the figure of a king in my cartoons to stand for a particular president or a government in general. Here's an example of that. I'm concerned about my legacy. Kill the historians. Of course, the big scare, the big worry, always makes it into my cartoons. Don't freak out. It's just to save the date. And this death figure, you've all seen if you follow New Yorker cartoons, appears a lot. And he's one of the many wonderful cliches that we cartoonists have to play with, like the desert island and the pearly gates. And every week when we do our batches, when I do my batch to send in, I throw in one of these just to see, maybe I can do the death cartoon or the pearly gates cartoon or the desert island cartoon that no one's ever done before, that completely pushes it to someplace it's never been. One of the other themes that pops up so often, cliches, is of course, animals, dogs and cats. Having two cats, this is one of my favorites. We never spoon anymore. Now, believe me, it has nothing to do with my personal life, believe me. So my experience at the New Yorker, it took me 25 years to get accepted, 25 years of rejection. And during that time, I felt a little like this. Then I thought, hey, hold on a minute. Maybe failure is an option. But I did keep submitting. And eventually in 1997, I sold my first one. And I have been in the magazine ever since. And the day I sold my first one, I have to say, was maybe the greatest day of my life. What's kind of sad about it is that what I didn't understand when I sold it, which was in October, was that the cartoon doesn't come out necessarily the next week or the week after that. In fact, the cartoon that I sold, my first one, didn't come out till the following July. So what's sad about that is that I called my father first thing when I sold it. And he knew enough, he knew the New Yorker, and he knew enough to be, even though he didn't want me to be a cartoonist in particular, he knew that it was important, and he was a little proud of me. However, a week or two went by and he didn't see the cartoon. And when I called him, he'd say, David, I got my New Yorker. You're not in there. Then a few weeks later, same thing. Where is it? You're not in there. Are you sure you actually sold it? And so the sad part was that he died on New Year's Eve of 1997. And he never got to see my cartoon in the magazine, which is a little sad for me. So I thought, just to finish up, I'd first give you a little bit of inside baseball about one aspect of the New Yorker that's really fun to poke fun at, and that is the famous fact checkers. Fact checkers are a big deal at the magazine. Several years ago, I handed in this cartoon. I'm having my entrails read. I got a message not long after that, handing it in, from the assistant cartoon editor that went like this. Oh, sorry. He said, the fact-checking department has a problem with the cartoon. They note that there are 5 columns on the front of the temple. Those temples only really had even number columns. And the biggest problem is the knife. They used a curved knife to sacrifice, not a straight knife. And they even sent me a picture of the correct knife. So what I did was I did the drawing again, and then I sent this email to the assistant editor. Colin, I will make the suggested changes, but I have a question of my own for the fact-checking department. I understand that they have a problem with the inaccurate knife and the incorrect number of columns, but what about the fact that the drawing includes a talking goat? So here's the way the final cartoon looked. I'm having my entrails read, proper columns, proper knife. So I thought to finish up, I would do one more short reading from the book. This is from near the end, and it's after something pretty terrible happened to me and to my wife, and pretty much the worst thing that ever happened to us. And in order to kind of give ourselves a break, we went out to Montauk on Long Island for a weekend and stayed at a place called the Panoramic View, which is a now defunct motel that had literally a panoramic view of the beaches of Montauk. And this scene takes place when we're sitting out on the balcony together, trying to get through this difficult time. And I said to her, well, first I said, we were sitting there and I went into the room and brought back my small leather portfolio. I unzipped it and took out 2 copies of a drawing I'd brought with me. Look at this, I said, and I showed her the first drawing. She said, that's always hanging above your desk. I smiled, that's right. The fact is, I've been staring at it forever because I've always been convinced that there's a terrific cartoon hidden in plain sight somewhere inside it, sort of like what I said about the God cartoon before. It's like when something is on the tip of your tongue and you just can't come up with it, but for years. And then the first time I sat down at my desk since everything happened, I was contemplating it as usual. And before I realized what was happening, I added this to it. I put down the first drawing and showed her this second one. Ah, that's fantastic, Ginny exclaimed. I love it. Listen, I said, when an idea comes to me like this, it's as if it happens to me, almost as if I had nothing to do with it, like it came out of nowhere, a gift from the cartoon gods. And I know this sounds over the top, but every time it happens like that, I get this rush, an intense physical pleasure that feels like pure joy. And it's like fireworks go off in my brain, starbursts behind my eyes. More than anything else about my work, it makes me love what I do. Ginny started to say something, but I stopped her with a raised finger. As long as I can have that experience, I went on, as long as I can sit down and draw and come up with ideas, blow my mind once in a while with what pops into my head, I will always feel like everything is going to be all right. Since I was a little kid, I held up the drawing and shook it. This has been my happy place. First day? Okay, so that is my presentation.
That was amazing and just wonderful. And I thank you so much for sharing all that. I have a lot of questions, but I also just wanted to invite those of you who are participating. Since we're an intimate crowd today, I am going to unmute you if you have a question. So I ask that you go ahead and hit the raise hand button, and David and I will start. I have lots of questions for you, but if you would like to ask a question or just have a comment about anything you've seen, we'd love for you to throw it in the chat. Sorry, the chat's not working, so in the Q&A, or just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll hear from you in a moment. I think it's amazing that you kind of explored for us your process. And I think I want to plumb a little bit of the things that you brought up a little bit more. You know, I'm trained in folklore and oral history, and usually the story that you hear, you have to say, well, tell me more. It's an interesting opposite process of a cartoonist. You're trying to get to the exact final statement in your cartoon that works the best and captures things. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that moment when you did finally get into the New Yorker? The story about your dad and not seeing the actual publication. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second one, since you ended with a Yiddish phrase, versteh, you know, there's another one, which is machen 11, you know, which is how does one make a living from a cartoon that you get in and 6 or 8 months later, the cartoon is published? So maybe it's a two-parter question for you.
Well, I can tell you, as I said, that the day I sold that cartoon, I had to pinch myself. I had been dreaming of being in the New Yorker since I was a little boy. When I was 6 or 7 years old, I would draw those cartoons I mentioned in the introduction cut them out and paste them into the magazine over the cartoons that were there so that I could see myself as a New Yorker cartoonist. So needless to say, the 25 years of not getting in was really brutal for me. But I had no choice, because if you do what I do, there's a New Yorker and then everything else. And I knew I would never feel successful until I was in there. So I kept trying, and I kept thinking, it's not my problem, it's their problem. My cartoons are good. Someday somebody's going to know that. And fortunately for me, there was a change in editors, and that worked in my favor. And I sold not long after that. And what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
The second part is just give us a sense of, for 25 years trying to get into the New Yorker. And then once you do, what is the sort of avenue for the professional track for cartoonists?
Well, it's not as my father would have warned me, it's not a way to make a lot of money. It's not a way to get rich. The great thing about the New Yorker is they do pay a million times better than anyone else, which is really good. But still, it's tough to make a living just from doing that. I've been really lucky. I've been able to have a long life with only having one job, real job, many, many years ago, from which I actually got fired. And I've made my living more or less just doing cartoons and selling them all those 25 years to other publications. And, lived pretty close to the edge, but made us decent living. But if that's what you're concerned about, you probably shouldn't choose this career.
It's amazing. So I was actually friends with Sacha Coren in New York, and obviously one of your colleagues recently passed away, also an amazing cartoonist at the New Yorker. Can you talk a little bit about the cultural connections and relationships that cartoonists have at the New Yorker? Actually, a dear friend from Seattle just became the Society of Illustrators executive director in New York. I will introduce you to her, but I'm curious about the culture of cartoonists and your relationships.
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that Ed was a great cartoonist, Ed Koren, and he went to my high school. So we had that in common. We were born in the same hospital, actually, which we joked about. The culture is become more difficult in the past few years, precisely because there was an ending to something called the Cartoonist Lunch, which had been going on since 1925. And when I was first in the magazine, and up until really the magazine moved from Midtown Manhattan down to the World Trade Center, and then COVID happened. Every Tuesday, when you brought in your work to show to the editor, afterwards, everybody would recover by going out to a restaurant called the Pergola des Artistes in the theater district, which famously had a $8.95 lunch and a free glass of wine, which was really important to the cartoonist. And that's where I experienced the culture, in that I met, first of all, I met all my heroes. I met Sam Gross. I met George Booth. I met Ed Koren. And also I met all the younger guys, people my age and even younger. And what's wonderful about cartoonists, and I was in the serious art world for about 20 years. I made sculpture. And it was so different because cartoonists are so generous, and you could sit there at the lunch and show people your work, and they tell you how they thought you could do this one better or that one better. And that kind of kindness, and because we all share the suffering that goes with the fact that the magazine sees about 1,000 cartoons a week, and they buy about 10. And so you can get a sense of how much rejection is involved. So you need the support of your colleagues. And that was a wonderful thing about the lunch. But when the magazine moved downtown to the World Trade Center, it was a more difficult place to make that happen. And then COVID came and people stopped going in. And so right now, I really miss that connection. It's all virtual at this point. So that's it. Yep.
Well, I have one more question about the New Yorker, and then I definitely want to talk a little bit more about what does it mean to do a memoir. And I have a lot of questions about that. And then I see that Hannah has a question, so we'll unmute her in just a moment. So be curious about the culture of the New Yorker as well. You mentioned how fact checkers, copy editors can affect your work, and that was an incredible story. I'm just wondering, how is it that you work together, and how have there been other examples where you've had to change your vision?
Well, I can tell you specifically about copy editors. They can be a problem because they want to correct the grammar, and people don't always talk correctly. And I'm writing lines of dialogues that real human beings that I depict are saying. And so sometimes they're not terribly grammatical. And so there's been some push and pull over the years around that. But what I can say about the magazine is that it's just been, as I say, it's just been such an amazing, miraculous thing for me just to be connected with it, because I so respect the magazine, the writing, and and of course the cartoons and everything else. And I still have to pinch myself. I can't believe I'm in there. I don't have a lot of connection right now with people. I have friends who are writers and I have friends who are cartoonists, but things have just become more isolated. They're just, like you were saying about your organization, things are starting to warm up a little now, and hopefully we New Yorker cartoonists and New Yorker artists will get back together more. There was a party recently, the first party in many years where I got to see a lot of my friends and colleagues.
Amazing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's so funny. I want to ask a little bit. I was really struck by how much dialogue you recreated throughout the entire book. And first of all, I want to say that if you think that David's cartoons are funny, his writing of his family dynamics and the conversations and how you separated it into all these really interesting thematic chapters is really a joy and a pleasure to read. And summer's coming up, so I think all of you will really, really enjoy the book. There's links to purchase through Island Books. But I'm curious about how it is that your work as a cartoonist, which is about finding that perfect phrase or not, wound up with so much dialogue in your book, because you had to recreate these conversations that were happening with your mom, with your dad, and your siblings, and so on. So tell us a little bit about how you decided to write so much.
There's a lot of things to say about that. For one thing, I'm mostly comfortable writing dialogue. When I'm writing dialogue, it just flows. I've never had a problem in the book writing that. Also, I wanted to find a way that I could get information to the reader without telling the reader, but showing the reader. And dialogue is a wonderful way to do that, because you're telling them, but you're telling them in a way that's entertaining. And so that was a somewhat of a conscious choice on my part, but also I just love writing dialogue. It just comes really easily. It's all those cartoon captions over the years, I guess. The other thing is that people ask, well, how did you remember those conversations so vividly? And what I learned early on, I had said at the beginning of my presentation that I had some issues when I started writing the memoir. And one of them was about memory. And I thought, how am I going to remember everything correctly? And I was reading a wonderful memoir by John le Carré, who's my favorite novelist, called The Pigeon Tunnel. And in it, he said, memory is as elusive as a wet bar of soap. And he gave himself permission, and I gave myself permission to write not so much something that could be fact-checked, but write it as I remembered it. One thing you learn in therapy over the years is that how you remember something is far more important than what actually happened. That says more about you. And once I let myself experience that truth, the writing came much more easily, and I stopped worrying. So that's how I got all those lines of dialogue exactly right.
You also have that wonderful cartoon in the book, of course, which is the therapy session with the fact checker sitting in the corner. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Hannah. I hope you're still there. I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question. Thanks a lot. Hannah, let's see. Can you say something? I think you're still on mute.
How about that? Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes, please ask your question.
Well, I heard David, I heard your interview on Terry Gross's Fresh Air last year, I think it was. And I went out and I ordered your book on the library because I liked ordering books from the library. And I loved your book. I enjoyed it. It was wonderful. I would laughed and I cried and, all the things in between. And it's that scene, one of the scenes that sticks out in my head is the one at your father's funeral where these people that you've never met before, it turns out that your father's family come in. And the intimation, you intimate that that they're Orthodox Jews. That's what it sounded like to me. And but you've never seen them before, and then they left and never saw them again. Have you ever connected with your father's family?
Okay. What I can say is you're exactly right. That orthodoxy was difficult for my father, as his whole life was about assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to be a full-blooded American. He was happy to be Jewish, but he wanted mostly to be assimilated. His store was called Revere Jewelers. And I mentioned in the book that some of the customers started calling him Mr. Revere, and he never bothered to correct them because he liked feeling that level of assimilation. And so, as I also said, he never revealed almost anything about that original family of his. And that moment that they appeared was really shocking. It upset him. But for me, it kind of finally lifted the veil, and I understood that perhaps that orthodoxy was the reason that that there was so much conflict between him and his family, so that they never had any connection. I never met my grandparents. I never met any of those people. So, in this second part of your question, I have gotten Facebook messages and Instagram messages and even some emails from people from my father's family, generations later, even younger than me. But I can't explain it, but somehow it feels disloyal to my father to act on them. And I've just decided that's not something I want to do. Like I said a minute ago, how I remember things is what's important to me, not what actually happened. So I have no need to, at this point, to find out anymore. I'm happy to sit with my father's refusal to go down that road. It makes me feel better about honoring him.
Yeah, I get that. And it was your mother's funeral, not your father, right? It was your mother's, when your mother passed away. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And I appreciate your perspective, and thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thank you for everything you said.
That was really a great question. So something that actually Hannah brought up, and I'll ask Hannah I'm going to mute you just real quick. This idea that you mentioned in the book of something funny and about something scary. So many of your cartoons do depict the Grim Reaper and lots of, shrink sessions. And, there's that idea that Sholem Aleichem also calls Lachen mit Tränen, right? It's laughter with tears. And I'm curious to know how much of your work is coming from that place, why that is generative versus the bright side of life, or just the funny side. What is it about that tension between funny and scary that so informs your work?
Well, again, like I said, it's not like I sit down and I think of, making a cartoon about something scary or something upsetting. It's just who I am. These are the things that interest me. Sometimes a little too much, but the humor that's embedded in anxiety, that's embedded in fear, is the best kind of humor, because it allows us to laugh at the things that scare us and upset us. And it's, as I said it before, it's not a kind of therapy for me. It's more, I just feel really fortunate that I have this creative urge to make cartoons about that sort of a thing that takes the edge off them a little bit and allows me to go on with my life without obsessing about them. Because there's a kind of thrill in making a really good cartoon about something terrible. It's really hard to do, really hard. But, for example, after 9/11, I wanted to make a cartoon about it, but it was just impossible. But one day I did, and it got published, and made me feel a little better about the whole thing.
It's an interesting way of processing. So I wanted to just give you a last chance to say if there's something that you feel that we missed in the conversation or that you'd like to share with people about, what does it mean to do a cartoon memoir versus a graphic novel version of a memoir, and just the form that you've chosen and the process of writing this. Maybe you could just share a little bit more with us, and then thank you all for being here. We'll say our goodbyes, but last chances to ask a question are now. And thank you so much. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your process of cartoon memoir versus graphic novel memoir.
I made a conscious choice because I love writing prose, and it was daunting for me at first, because what's wonderful about cartoons is that you get an idea and you put it down, it's done. And you get the thrill of completion, and you go out and get yourself lunch and the day's over. Writing a book, I thought, how am I ever going to match that process? What I discovered when things are going well, it's like a series of those moments, a series of insights, not just one isolated insight. And once I began to experience that, the book started coming more easily. I love to write. And so that's why I'm not that interested in doing a graphic memoir. I'm really interested in the idea of prose combined with the cartoons, the way I did it. I can't hear you, Pam.
Apologies. I am so grateful for the time that you spent with us today on Sunday. I loved your book. Just like Hannah said, it is funny, it is poignant. It's also peeling back the stories behind this single image and single phrase. And I think everyone will really enjoy it. It's a great gift for anyone who's a New Yorker in your life. But I just want to thank you all for joining us. And David, thank you very much for making time. I also want to thank the Jewish Book Council, which I didn't thank previously, who have been a partner to us in presenting this, as well as Island Books. So thank you all for coming. David, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.